14-foot skeletons buried in ancient mounds, elongated skulls with DNA that doesn't match any known human population. Biblical texts describe the offspring of angels and mortal women, and every civilization that has ever existed seems to pass down stories of giants, beings of immense size and strength who once ruled this earth. Modern science calls them folklore, but history and archaeological evidence points to a different answer. Giants? They're real. This may come as a shock to some of you, but before researching this, I had no idea where giants came from. Doesn't it seem like they've always just been around in our collective human history since the beginning of history? Why does almost every culture on Earth have stories about them? We are going to dive in the deep end for the answers to those very questions. Let's start with a theory that is probably the most prominent one: the Nephilim. The rise of the Nephilim is just casually mentioned in the Bible, but extensively detailed in the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. Many of you may not have heard of these last two books because they're not considered canonical, not part of the official Bible. But even that statement's going to get me in trouble right off the bat, because the official Bible depends on whether you follow the Catholics and their 73 books or the Protestants with their 66 books. But neither version contains the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. However, that does not mean that we should not look to these books for important information. In fact, the Book of Enoch is referenced numerous times in other books of the Bible. And 11 copies of the Book of Enoch and 10 copies of the Book of Giants were found among the stash of religious documents known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. But before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves off the northwest shore of the Dead Sea between roughly 1946 and 1956, we wouldn't have even known about the Book of Enoch if it weren't for the fact that it is contained in the Ethiopian Bible, which has 81 books. Clearly, early Christians were paying attention to what was written in these books. In any case, let's just start at the beginning. We have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as the start of all mankind. And to keep an eye on them, God appoints angels, called the Watchers, not to be confused with the Dark Watchers of California, which we cover in a separate video. A link for that one will be in the description. Anyway, these Watchers are on Earth to babysit us as we develop. We all know from the earlier angel rebellion, when some angels were cast out of heaven, that angels, just like us, have free will. So these Watchers, they have free will as well. And just like it does for most of us, that gets some of the Watchers in trouble. As they're hanging out, just watching us multiply, they start to notice that some of the ladies down here are looking particularly captivating. That the sons of God saw the daughters of man, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Genesis 6:2. Instead of staying out of sight, they decide to come down to earth and take wives and start families. 200 of them gather on top of Mount Hermon to swear an oath to one another, like the 200 musketeers, all for one and one for all, because they know that they are literally inviting the wrath of God for doing this. The Watchers take wives who bear them children, giants that we have come to know as the Nephilim. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Genesis 6:4. And they're right. God ain't happy. But God gives the Nephilim 500 years to live, and they just tear it up all over Earth. They're always hungry, and when they can't find enough animals to eat, they start eating humans. Eventually, because they're inherently evil and out of control, they start warring amongst themselves and wipe themselves out for the most part. And not only do the Watchers taking wives from the daughters of men corrupt the flesh of men, but they also impart knowledge to men. Knowledge we weren't supposed to find out about, like how to make weapons, witchcraft, and how to make cosmetics. But even though the original generation of Nephilim might have killed each other off, according to the Bible, all of earthly flesh was now corrupted. All of it except Noah. Noah's line is the last line of purity, never mingled with Nephilim DNA. Neither were his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So when Noah's about ready to get on the boat 7 days before the flood, he is to quickly pick wives for his 3 sons. However, the Bible says all other flesh was corrupted. So here's Noah trying to pick wives for his sons out of a polluted pool. But he has no choice. He can't really populate the world without the ladies. So here we have this huge flood that is meant to wipe out not only all evil men, but all evil giants as well. But then we gotta restart all of humanity with tainted DNA. After the worldwide flood, Noah's son Ham and his wife roll snake eyes and end up the winners of the defective gene pool, starting the lineage that is eventually known as the Canaanites, who were evil giants that God then tasked the Israelites with wiping out later. But I guess this way the evil had been brought down to a manageable size. Or another theory called the multiple incursions theory is that while the original 200 watchers who stood together on Mount Hermon and made a pinky swear to stick together were hunted down, bound, and tossed into the abyss until the final judgment day, another group of angels decided that taking a crack at the gorgeous earth women was worth the risk and fathered a whole new generation of giants, one that persists to this day. Those watchers sure are a wily, nefarious bunch. Aren't beings that come down from heaven supposed to be good? But I guess it just goes to show you that you really can never be sure who has your best interest at heart. That is as true today as it was then. But at least we have tools today that can help keep us safe from those who are not so well-intentioned. And one of those tools is private internet access, the sponsor of this episode. Private internet access is a virtual private network, or VPN. That means they basically mask your location and private information so no one on the internet knows who or where you are, so you can travel the internet without anyone tracking your every move, collecting all of your data along the way. Even private internet access doesn't log your activities. Private internet access makes sure that those watchers are not watching you. Not to mention the fact that VPNs, since they are hiding your location, can unlock region-specific content, meaning your Netflix library just got bigger and you have more games to watch. Plus, when you have a private internet access account, that account can be used on all of your devices. And if you go to piavpn.com/theinbetween, or click on our link in the description, or scan the QR code, you can get 83% off on private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month. And you also get 4 extra months completely for free. How do you beat that? So go to piavpn.com/theinbetween, scan the QR code, or click the link in the description and sign up for private internet access today. Now, let's get back to those giants. Depending on who you talk to, those giants might be real living creatures that roam the earth, hiding in caves, or, according to some researchers, the Nephilim have spirits that live on after they die, just like we do. So their spirits remain to roam the earth forever, continuously looking for new bodies to inhabit, and are even considered by some to be the unclean spirits that Jesus casts out in the New Testament. Okay, that's one origin story for the existence of giants. But it's not the only one. The other origin story involves something a little farther out there, both figuratively and literally. A subject that I can't believe that we haven't covered before now. The one, the only, the Anunnaki. So this particular theory starts with a planet called Nibiru, or the 12th planet, or Planet 9, or Planet X. It spends most of its time way out past the other 9 planets of our solar system. Yes, Pluto is a planet, fight me, and only swings back around every 3,600 years or so to pass through our part of the hood before heading back out to parts unknown. And 450,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Nibiru The Anunnaki, an alien race very similar to humans with the exception of their elongated skulls and that they're 12 to 15 feet tall, they had a problem. Nibiru was an industrialized planet, but had managed to keep control of the pollution until the volcanoes erupted. Their ash and gases overwhelmed the system and, along with the failing ozone layer, began an environmental death spiral for the whole planet. The Anunnaki have a lifespan of 200,000 years, and Anu has been their leader for the last 50,000 years. Anu has two sons, Enlil and Enki. Enlil works with their scientists to figure out that they can save the planet if they spray microscopic gold particles into the atmosphere to reflect the sun's radiation coming through the non-existent ozone. The only problem is they don't have any gold. So they set out searching for planets who do and found Earth. They know Earth has life, but it's just a few primitive bipedal creatures who are less than half the size of the Anunnaki. So they figure if we have to, we can take them. So they send out a party of 300 Anunnaki and 600 Igigi headed to Earth with a mission of setting up a city and mining Earth's gold. The Igigi are actually a separate alien civilization that had been conquered by the Anunnaki many years earlier and made into their own personal slave force. So once they land on Earth in the area that we know today as Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki, under the rule of Anu's son, Enki, put the Igigi to work building a settlement called Eridu, giving them all of 7 days to do it. The Igigi are a little grumpy, but they get it done, and then move on to digging for that gold. And dig they did. For about 150,000 years, with ships arriving regularly to take the gold back to Nibiru. But it's not enough. They need more gold. Enki tells the Igigi, work harder. And what was terrible treatment before gets even worse in trying to get the Igigi to work harder. But the Igigi are done. Under their leader, Atrahasis, the Igigi proclaim, mine your own gold. They collapse the mines and attack the city. They lose and are quickly brought back under control, but the Igigi still refuse to go back to work. Enlil, who's like the top administrator guy, says they're treasonous, they all gotta go. But Enki, more of a science guy, says, slow down, we're not gonna kill them. I got a way better idea. Let's use the locals. They're not really smart enough right now, but if we give them a little of our DNA, I'm sure we can come up with something smart enough to work the mines, but not smart enough to ask questions. Takes a few tries to get it right, giving us a few mistakes along the way, like the Cyclops, but they managed to develop a race of hominid that we know today as Homo sapien, the first of which they name Adamu, which means first man in Sumerian. And if you haven't guessed already, how long ago did Homo sapiens enter the fossil record, according to mainstream archaeology? About 300,000 years ago, right about the time the Igigi call it quits. So, okay, problem solved. Now we have this custom-made local force to dig for us, and the mining continues. But it turns out that human nature isn't just for humans. I don't know if it's out of boredom or because after being here 150,000 years, he's starting to get the itch to settle down and start a family or what, but Enki starts eyeing the human women and starts messing around. Big no-no. But he does it anyway, and to no one's surprise, has a son named Adapa. So Adapa, being part Anunnaki and part human, is a little smarter than the other humans. And his lineage starts asking questions. Why are we mining gold? Gold must be important. I want some of that. Beginning our preoccupation as a species with gold as a valued commodity. And Adapa's offspring are not as docile as their forefathers. They fight back. And either through violence or attrition, the new aggressive human 2.0 thrives, and the more docile human 1.0 dies out. But human 2.0 turns out to be a little too successful. They overpopulate the cities and start riots over the lack of food. Enlil, ever the administrator, tries to control the violence by thinning the population through plagues and famine. Enki intercedes on their behalf, and a deal is struck that humans would have to leave the city of Eridu, including its lush and beautiful garden named Eden, and fend for themselves in the real world. So they do, and spread themselves out all over the planet. Now, some humans retain their relationships with the Anunnaki, producing hybrid offspring that sometimes, to humans at least, are giants. Some of them are still known today, giants like Gilgamesh, Hercules, and Samson, all pretty much good guys. On the flip side, relationships with the Igigi produce giants of the not-so-nice variety, like Goliath, who are a little more ill-tempered and tend to eat humans. But that is the state of affairs for a while, until we roll around to 12 to 13,000 years ago. The Anunnaki have all the gold they need, and Nibiru is on course to swing back around for an easy pickup of any Anunnakians left on Earth. So they all pretty much say adios and thanks for all the gold, leaving humanity to fend for itself. However, the problem is that Nibiru doesn't exactly follow the same exact path every time it swings in for a visit. It varies a bit, sometimes further away, sometimes closer. And this pass is going to be a close one. So close that the gravitational pull between the two will be so strong that it's pretty much going to wreck Earth as we know it. Floods, earthquakes, you name it. Can you say Younger Dryas event? Enlil pretty much says, so what? They serve their purpose, and we have what we need. What's the issue? But Enki couldn't let the humans go so easily. Remember, he's the one who took a human wife and had human children. He kind of has a soft spot for us. Up until this point, we've been doing okay for ourselves, but we're not exactly a shining example. We're violent, rude, and pretty much a menace. So Enki proposes that one good man, Utnapishtim, his family, and a good representative sampling of all living animals be given at least a chance at survival. Utnapishtim builds an ark, loads everyone on it, and manages to ride out the gravitational fury that rages across the entire surface of the Earth and restart humanity from the 8 people aboard. Sound familiar? And just like the Nephilim story, giants repopulate in the Anunnaki version of events the same way, either through the genetics of the flood survivors or because of another visit from the Anunnaki. Because even though we managed to survive the flood and start over, all knowledge of past civilization is lost to time, and we are pretty much left to start from scratch. Except Nibiru makes another, not-so-catastrophic pass about 3,600 years ago. The Anunnaki use the opportunity to check in on us and make some tweaks to their creations, namely shortening our lifespans and decreasing our immunity from disease. But they also hung around for a while to reteach us some important skills before they left again, giving us back our knowledge of language, mathematics, and astronomy. Coincidentally enough, that last pass 3,600 years ago just happens to correspond to the rise of the Sumerian civilization. But whether you take the biblical approach or the Anunnaki approach, the final upshot is that we mere mortals now have giants living among us. Interesting that if you take the biblical approach for timing, it clocks out that the original visit by the Watchers was during the days of Jared, which puts the Nephilim on Earth from 3,500 to 3,000 BC, just slightly before the Sumerians started talking about the Anunnaki around 2,500 to 2,000 BC, which is also the same time frame that the Greeks were chattering about their Titans and Olympians. The Greeks don't throw their hat in the ring for having a true origin story, but their mythological history contains lots of giants that we will touch on in a bit, but I just wanted to throw that in there as an interesting coincidence. And an even more interesting coincidence is the fact that the Greeks have a flood myth too. And so does everyone else. There are over 100 cultures around the world that have so-called flood myths. And if you account for regional variations, that number goes up to more like 300. And consider that these 100 or more stories come from disparate cultures all across the globe. People who are not known to have had any contact with others. China, North America, India, Africa, Australia, Polynesia, all have stories of a major flood almost wiping out humanity. And while modern academia might consider these merely myths passed down over the ages by a multi-generational game of operator, the people in those cultures consider these stories as their actual history. And even more interesting is that many of those same cultures have an origin story that includes some higher power infusing some part of their essence, like their breath or their blood, with something earthly like clay to create mankind. And to come back from my digression following this line of amazing coincidences, these same cultures all have legends of giants. Earlier, we touched on the Greeks having many stories of giants. Between the Greeks and the Romans, we have some of the most famous stories of giants. The Greeks have characters like Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, and Achilles. The Romans have Hercules, Aeneas, and Romulus and Remus. Not all giants, but all have something about them that is superhuman, and all the product of a union between a god and a human. The Bible has Goliath, Samson, and Og, whose bed was 14 feet long, all from Nephilim lineage. The Sumerians have Gilgamesh, who is actually referenced in the Book of Giants, and who is the son of the goddess Ninsun. Now, to be fair, some of these many giant myths talk about more creation-type giants. Giants that are larger than life and said to create certain aspects of the world that we live in. Like the Chinese giant Khufu, who chased the sun, died of thirst, and created China's mountains and forests. Or even closer to home, we have the hero of the Great Lakes region, Paul Bunyan, who created Minnesota's 10,000 lakes with his footprints and the hills, valleys, and the Great Lakes by wrestling with Babe, his blue ox. But today, we are talking about flesh and blood giants who walk the earth. Albania has a giant that is as tall as the pine trees with a knee-length black beard who captures men for food and women as servants. The Irish and the Celts tell tales of seafaring giants who raid other ships, enslaving entire human crews. The Aztecs had a race called the Quinametsin, who were 12-foot tall pre-human giants who built grand civilizations, but were destroyed by the gods for neglecting to worship them. The Brits have their story of Gog-Magog, not to be confused with the evil forces talked about in the Bible. This guy's a towering 12-foot giant who is said to be the last of his kind in ancient Britain. Known for his brute strength and crabby attitude, he uprooted trees to use as weapons as he roamed the land. According to legend, he was defeated by the warrior Cornelius, who threw him off a cliff, clearing the island of giants for good. The Spanish talk about the Oaniahu, 10-foot, possibly cycloptic giants with red hair who produce asexually and are feared by the fairies. Considering that the fairies of old seem to be some pretty tough and sometimes nasty little creatures, that's saying something. We have legends and stories from places like Malta and Sardinia, the Solomon Islands and Mexico. And the Native Americans? The now famous or infamous Sasquatch, also known as Bigfoot. So it's pretty obvious that we have a long history of giants in our collective consciousness. And it's my personal belief that all of these separate legends must have originated from the same story. But which one? Now, if you're leaning toward the Anunnaki side of the scale, it has to be stated that the majority of the Anunnaki version of how they came to be comes from one man, Zecharia Sitchin, who wrote the book The 12th Planet in 1976. His version of events is way different than those of establishment Sumerian researchers. He is widely criticized for his interpretation of the cuneiform scripts that make up the Sumerian text. And it's entirely possible that he made some mistakes. But what I love about this guy is that after he moved to New York in 1952 with his degree in economics, he was working for an executive at a shipping company. He taught himself to read cuneiform script as a hobby and translated thousands of tablets for fun. Who does that? But despite the establishment pushback, there are plenty of people who back up his idea of ancient astronauts and alien intervention in human development. M.J. Evans, a PhD in environmental geography and longtime colleague and contributor to Sitchin's work, agrees with his assessment of the Anunnaki and Nibiru. Eric von Daniken, most known for his book Chariots of the Gods, wrote several books advocating for the ancient astronaut theory. And author and filmmaker L.A. Marzulli takes the idea one step further, advocating for the idea that both the Anunnaki and biblical Nephilim theories are correct, that they are one in the same. And there is actually some evidence to back all of this up. In 2020, researchers at the Max Planck Institute identified a specific gene called TKTL1. This gene is specific to Homo sapiens, differing from other hominids by one amino acid. The absence of this one amino acid allows Homo sapiens greater neuron production, which in turn means enhancements in brain development, particularly in the neocortex, which is associated with higher cognitive functions like reasoning and language. Now, whether that change comes from an alien hybrid program or from the hand of God, who knows? But it sure put Homo sapiens on the fast track. And then we have the city of Ur. According to the Sumerians, they built the city around 2100 BC. In the Bible, it's the birthplace of Abraham. In the Anunnaki version of history, it's an Anunnaki administrative hub. But in all of those contexts, it was thought to be a mythical city. But just like the city of Troy was proven to be real in 1868, Ur was brought out of the realm of myth by John George Taylor in 1854. And even better, in 1927, archaeologist Leonard Woolley found the tomb of Queen Puabi from the first dynasty of Ur. Guess what? Our dear queen has an elongated skull just like the Anunnaki. Today, her remains are kept at the Natural History Museum in London. And before his death in 2010, Zecharia Sitchin made a request to the museum that they run her DNA. The museum's response? Nope. Any request for testing would need to come from a recognized researcher with appropriate expertise. Gatekeepers! And her DNA has not been tested to this day. However, we do have evidence of elongated skulls elsewhere in the world, namely the Paraca skulls in Peru, and those have been tested. And wouldn't you know it, turns out that those skulls have genetic markers from the Middle East. Those skulls have been dated to around 800 to 100 BC, with some speculation that they could go back as far as 3000 BC. Now, it's not likely that parties from the Middle East were hanging out in Peru in 500 BC. So how did Middle Eastern DNA get into the Peruvian population? Unless maybe they both had visits from the same sky gods who had a little bit more than just babysitting the natives on their minds. Okay, I know I got a bit off track there, but that stuff was just too juicy to leave out. But let's get back to the original question at hand. Did giants, long ago, roam the earth? Well, I gotta say that just the sheer number of stories about them from all corners of the earth tends to make me think they did. I just don't know which origin story is the right one. But regardless of where they came from, we are going to look at the evidence that giants have been here before and might still be here today. The world has always had its share of merely really tall people. In fact, in Prussia, during the reign of King Frederick William I from 1713 to 1740, King Freddie, a bit of an eccentric, created a special regiment within his army, comprised solely of soldiers that were 6 feet tall or taller, which was particularly tall for those times. I have no idea why he created this elite group of soldiers. Maybe it was just to fulfill some twisted fantasy? Or was it to have this imposing line of giants that would surely have made at least some of his adversaries think twice about taking on the Prussian army? Or maybe a bit of both. Whatever the reason, it worked for a while. Too bad he never actually taught them to fight, because when their giant regiment hit the front line, they pretty much folded like a cheap suit. Now, as fun of a tidbit of history as that is, they are not the kind of giants we are looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
We are looking for proof that actual giants roamed the earth. Fun fact! According to the Historia Augusta, which is a collection of biographies of the Roman emperors. Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who reigned for a whole 3 years from 235 to 238 AD, is said to have stood 8 feet 6 inches tall. Interesting, but we are looking for the ones with the legendary red hair, 6 fingers and toes, and 2 rows of teeth that stand at least 8 feet tall. Globally, 0.000038% of the population is 7 feet or taller, which gives us about 3,000 out of a world population of 8 billion. That's a pretty small club, but that still means that over time, a lot of the 7-foot skeletons recovered may not really be anything other than hitting a gene jackpot. We are looking for the big mammer jammers. So where do we start? Well, why don't we start with the megalithic structures we can still look at and touch today? Places like Stonehenge in England, the Gigantea temples in Malta, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Baalbek in Lebanon, and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Now, just like the Egyptian pyramids, mainstream archaeologists say that these stones could have been moved with relatively primitive engineering and a large workforce. Maybe that accounts for some of them, but not all. Take Baalbek in Lebanon. There stands the temple of Jupiter Baal, the biggest temple supposedly built by the Romans, although there's no written record of that happening. What makes this site not really fit the mainstream mold is what is known as the Baalbek stones. 6 gigantic pieces of quarried rock that defy the idea that men could just drag these things into place. 3 of them are known as the trilithon. A trilithon is usually 2 vertical pieces with a horizontal piece over the top, like at Stonehenge. So I have no idea why these 3 stones are called a trilithon as well, but it's 3 stones that have been put into place in one section of the temple complex. Each of the 3 stones is about 72 feet long, 14 feet high, and 12 feet thick, and estimated to be 750 to 800 tons. But those are just the babies. The other 3 clock in at 1,000 tons, or 2.2 million pounds, almost 1,300 tons, or almost 2.8 million pounds, and 1,500 tons, or 3.3 million pounds. Now, to be fair, the core of these rocks came from isn't very far away, so it's not like the ones that were moved like 500 miles or anything. And only the 3 smallest ones are actually in place. The 3 bigger ones are still in the quarry area. But still, that's nuts. It would take 5 to 10,000 people to move that much weight. That's a logistical nightmare. By comparison, the heaviest blocks in the Giza pyramids are only 80 tons max. Only. And we're still not 100% sure how that was done. I just don't see how blocks of this size could be maneuvered into place without high-tech machinery. But that's what we're told, that these megalithic sites were constructed by regular guys. Just a whole lot of them. Fine. Except, let's look at the site of Gigantea on the Maltese island of Gozo. Would have taken a lot of people to build this place, and there is evidence of some ancient agricultural activity on the island, but it's very doubtful that they could have grown enough crops to feed the entire crew. Local legends say that the site was built by Sunsuna, a giantess who single-handedly built the massive megalithic temples in a single day and night while nursing her infant child on her hip. The name Gigantea itself derives from the Maltese word for giant. Oh, and just for fun, let's talk about another site on Malta called the Hypogeum of Halsaflini, which is a 3-story underground sanctuary hewn out of solid rock. Not only are some of the walls specifically positioned with polished stone mirrors to reflect as much light as possible into the subterranean space, but some of the chambers are carved in such a way that when a tone of 110 hertz is played, it resonates through the entire underground complex, creating a powerful vibrating echo that you can not only hear, but also feel. Oh, and they found human remains of people with elongated skulls. I did not see that one coming. And since we're talking about Malta, I gotta tell ya, it really is a fascinating place. They have 7 major megalithic temple sites and a few minor ones, which is the highest concentration of these crazy huge structures packed into just 122 square miles. Not to mention that it's rumored that at one time, someone could cross from one side of the island to the other within their underground cave system. But apparently, you can't do that anymore. The government of Malta kind of took them over and used them to store disaster or wartime emergency supplies. This takeover and shutdown to public eyes was seemingly prompted by a horrific tragedy. According to the August 1940 edition of National Geographic, a group of students and teachers entered the underground maze of tunnels, never to resurface. It is said that people could hear wailing and crying for weeks afterward, but after searching for 3 weeks, no one was ever found. Tied into this tragedy is the story of one Lois Jessup. She's a British woman who visits the Hypogeum with some friends in the summer, sometime in the mid-1930s. Their tour guide, a guy named Joe, gives them each a candle and guides them through the winding passageways, stopping in various rooms with altars and hollow spaces scooped out of the rock walls, either for rest or for burial, continually moving down to the 3rd underground layer. They get to another room deep in the ground when Joe says, "That's it, tour's done." But Lois spies a little opening in one of the walls. "What's down there?" Joe looks at her. "Go there at your own risk," he replied, "and you won't go far." This is exactly the kind of adventure she'd been hoping for. 2 of the friends stay with Joe, but 3 of them decide to join her in checking out the mysterious tunnel. Lois has a dress on that day that has a long sash around the waist. The girls use it as a makeshift rope to hold on to her as she ducks into the tunnel with the others in tow. The foursome make their way through the tunnel, giggling at their own clumsiness as they slowly move forward, bent over in the low tunnel, holding their candles in front of them. Finally, the tunnel ends and opens up into a large cavern. Lois holds her candle up and sees that she's actually standing on a 2-foot wide ledge with a rock wall on her left and a 50-foot drop on her right. She takes a step and holds up her candle. There across the cave, from an opening deep below me, emerged 20 persons of giant stature. In single file, they walked along a narrow ledge. Their height I judged to be about 20 or 25 feet, since their heads came about halfway up the opposite wall. They walked very slowly, taking long strides. Then they all stopped, turned, and raised their heads in my direction. All simultaneously raised their arms and with their hands beckoned me. The movement was something like scratching or feeling for something, as the palms of their hands were face down. Terror rooted me to the spot. Her friends behind her start asking her, "Why'd you stop? Keep going." She takes another step forward and puts her left hand on the rock wall to keep her balance. But the rock wall is not a rock wall. It feels slimy, and it moves. Before she can look at what is moving under her hand, a gust of wind blows out her candle. She turns around, telling her friends, "Go back, go back. There's nothing really to see here." Once all of the girls are back in the room with Joe and the 2 other friends, they all ask Lois, "What did you see?" Lois tells them, "Nothing. The wind blew my candle out." She looks at Joe, who looks back at her like he knows exactly what she saw, like he had once seen it himself. The look in his eyes says to Lois, "Don't." So Lois never tells anyone about what she saw. Once they're all back up in the sunlight, Joe tells Lois, "You should always tour with the group. There's a teacher taking some of her students exploring soon. You could join them." But Lois never does, and never tells anyone about the giants she saw that day. A couple of weeks later, Lois's friend calls her and says, "Hey, I just read in the paper that a school teacher and a bunch of her students went exploring that same tunnel that we did. They were all roped together, but when the last person in the line turned the corner where your candle blew out, the rope was cut and a cave-in prevented any rescue." Several months later, Lois's sister is in town and wants to go to the hypogeum while she's there. Not real excited at the idea, Lois goes anyway. They have a different tour guide this time who takes them on the same route that Joe did, down the various levels and through the various rooms. When they get to the end, the room that had the tunnel entrance, Lois sees it's boarded up. She asks the tour guide, "Isn't that where the school kids got lost?" "Perhaps," is his only response. Lois asks, "Where's Joe, the other tour guide?" "I don't know any Joe." He shook his head. "I alone have been showing people around this catacomb for years." Now, I'm fairly confident that anyone who has ever looked into the possibility of giants has heard this story. It's pretty legendary. It's often debunked as just a story that Lois wrote for the Journal of Borderland Research. However, I found something else that I've never heard before. Many years after the Malta event, Lois became the secretary for the New York Saucer Information Bureau, which is just one of lots of UFO groups that sprung up in the UFO craze of the 1950s. After a lecture in New York called Flying Saucers and America's Destiny, that briefly talked about the cavern world in the interior of the Earth, Lois approached the speaker, Riley Crabb, to tell him of her experience in the hypogeum. She described the huge cave giant she saw to Mr. Crabb, telling him their covering seemed to be like long white hair, combed downward and shaggy looking. Their heads were oval and elongated at the chin and top, and the hair on their heads fell about the shoulders like a draped monk's cowl. Mr. Crabb belonged to an organization called the Borderland Sciences Research Foundation and was the editor of their magazine, the Journal of Borderland Research, which published stories and research about topics like UFOs and occultism and unexplained phenomena, the borderland being the space between science and the supernatural. Mr. Crabb admits that he found her story a little hard to believe, but after he and Mrs. Crabb spent a good chunk of the next 2 days with Lois, he said he found her to be very level-headed. But it wasn't until he got home and had a chance to do some research on Malta that he read the National Geographic article about the lost school children and the underground tunnels, and another Nat Geo article that talked about one of the rooms of the hypogeum having a hollow-sounding floor, meaning that there are areas yet to be explored. I don't know if those two things alone convinced him or if he found other information that backed up Lois's story, but something he found made him a believer. Because in the end, Lois was invited to share her now legendary story in the Journal of Borderland Research. Now, here's what I find interesting about all of this. Why would someone go up to a lecturer she doesn't know and start telling him about a fictional story she wrote? They wouldn't. I think this extra information from Mr. Crabb goes a long way to proving her story is real. Now, where the school children entered the catacombs is not clear. The Lois Jessup story says they went in the same place she did, on the bottom floor of the hypogeum. But the National Geographic story makes it sound like it could have been elsewhere. The tough part about the story of the school children is that the only two places it's even mentioned anywhere is the National Geographic article and the story of Lois Jessup. Remember that both of these stories were supposed to have taken place in the 1930s. But Malta was bombed out by Italy starting in June of 1940. Is it possible that any evidence and a good chunk of the eyewitnesses died in those air raids? Probably. Maybe that's why we didn't hear any more about it. Here's just a tiny point of interest. Children under the age of 6 are not allowed in the hypogeum. Interesting. Why not? Is it because they are small enough to crawl through openings that adults can't? If the hypogeum is not connected to the labyrinth of other underground tunnels, why seal off sections to the public? And the cave system is actually rumored to not only transverse the entire island, but to connect to the catacombs under the Vatican. However, that is a 400-mile stretch as the crow flies, tunneling under the Tyrrhenian Sea at a depth of 12,000 feet. I don't think so. And if you stayed in the shallows and just hugged the coastline of Italy, that becomes 650 miles, and it would still require tunneling down to depths of over 1,000 feet under the water. Again, I don't think so. But just because the mainline tunnel to the Vatican may not be real, that doesn't mean that giants on Malta aren't. Dr. Anton Mifsud, an author of several books on the history of Malta, claims that his friend living on Gozo Island has dug up a 10-foot skeleton, but he hid it from authorities. Can't say I blame him. And speaking of digging up giant skeletons, let's move from Malta to a place that seemingly has them everywhere, Sardinia. Sardinia is known to some as the land of the giants. Sardinian tales describe giants as a prehistoric race arriving around 12,000 years ago. Tall beings, over 12 feet tall, who arrived either from the sky or the sea and taught locals skills like building. They're linked to nuragis, stone towers surrounded by fortresses. There's over 7,000 of these things on the island, and they are found nowhere else on Earth. Legend says these were the homes of the giants. But some would say it's not just legend. In his second podcast with Michael Knowles, during their discussion of giants, author and researcher Timothy Alberino tells the following story told to him by the eyewitness. The witness's team was excavating the remains of one of those towers. The tower was sealed, but they managed to get it open and get inside. Using flashlights, they crawl inside, through a passage, and into a room. In the room, seated at a massive table on an oversized chair with a large plate and chalice in front of him, is a dead giant, estimated to be about 12 feet tall. The tower was practically hermetically sealed, so the body is nearly perfect. What was he eating when he died? Oysters! I'm certainly not going to say that this is the place where they originated, but it sure seems like the place where they all died. A common feature throughout the island is what's known as Tumba Deis Gigantes, or Tomb of the Giants. There are like 800 of these huge stone tombs all over the place that are said to have been built somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BC. Now, maybe these are tombs built for regular people, but I'm not so sure about that. Back in a time when survival itself was pretty dang hard, why would the people spend their time and energy making tombs this huge if it wasn't for someone important? And why make them so big if it wasn't for something of enormous stature? According to Alberino, it's not a very well-kept secret that farmers have been discovering giant remains in their fields for years. And it's said that archaeologists have uncovered countless giant skeletons that are whisked away by the universities that are sponsoring them, never to be seen again. But funny how the truth keeps leaking out. I found one article from the World News dated less than a year ago, talking about archaeologists in Sardinia finding skeletons of unusually large size, with femurs measuring more than 1.5 meters in length. That's almost 5 feet. The average human male femur tops out at about 20 inches, not even 2 feet. Here's my favorite part. Later in the same article, they state, some theories suggest that the large skeletons could belong to individuals of great stature, but not necessarily giants like those described in the legends. A 5-foot femur makes this guy between 15 and 20 feet tall. How is that not a right and proper giant? But Sardinia is, by far, not the only place with evidence of right and proper giants. Let's jump over to Peru. The Spanish, under Francisco Pizarro, hit the shores of Peru in 1532 and had pretty much conquered the entire country by 1535. In their quest to convert the entire population to Catholicism, soldiers roamed the countryside both with Catholic missionaries and with chroniclers to document the entire process. One such scribe, Pedro Ciazza de Leon, in his book Chronicles of Peru from 1553, documented indigenous accounts of giant remains found along Peru's coast, particularly near Santa Elena, which is in modern-day Ecuador. Locals described unearthing skeletons up to 12 feet tall with large skulls and robust bones, believed to be the remnants of a pre-Inca race of giants. These were tied to myths of a violent, tall people destroyed by divine forces. Another chronicler, Agustin de Sarate, heard the same stories in his travels around 1543, mentioning oversized bones that locals revered as ancestral giants. However, these remains reportedly crumbled or were lost after being sent to Spain for study, leaving no physical evidence. Now, what these Spanish Catholic conversion teams would do is go from indigenous village to indigenous village and destroy whatever statues or temples or altars the locals had, to destroy whatever god or gods, whatever thing that they were worshiping. But the Spanish were nothing if not meticulous in their record keeping. They kind of had to be, because anything of value that's found is confiscated, with 20% of it going back to the King of Spain. Going back to that podcast with Timothy Alberino, it is a great podcast, definitely worth a listen. He talks about records that survive to this day of one of these teams entering a village. They don't readily see any altars or obvious statues, so they ask the elders, "Where are the gods that you worship?" The elders say, "In the cave." So the priests and representatives of the Spanish crown go into the cave. The first thing that they see are bodies lying on the ground, presumably sacrifices to the gods. They keep going, and they find what the villagers are worshiping. There in front of them are 3 gigantic corpses sitting in chairs, dressed in the traditional garb of the indigenous people. The record states that these bodies are 6 times the size of a normal man. What did they do with said giants? They had the bodies removed from the cave and burned in the village. If you're leaning toward that story being folklore, just know that it comes right out of the same documents that we use to give us the entire history of the conquest of Peru. And those same documents show that this story is not an isolated incident. Not to mention that Peru is also the location of Sacsayhuaman, an Incan fortress near Cusco, built around 1400 AD, made with massive blocks estimated to be 1 to 200 tons each, the second biggest megalith blocks after those in Baalbek. They are precisely fitted, like a perfect jigsaw puzzle. Could this have been constructed by humans? Maybe, but would have been a whole lot easier for giants. Now, let's take a wander to areas a little closer to home for most of us, the United States. We may be kind of the new kids on the block as far as civilization goes, but there are records of giants being discovered everywhere here in the States. There are only about 1,000 newspaper reports from the 18 and 1900s about discoveries of giant skeletons, usually found inside burial mounds. The eastern side of the U.S. has more than its fair share of these mounds, and a ton of those 1,000 reports come from that part of the country. Too many to go into, but let's take a quick gander at the top 5. At number 5, we have the Serpent Mound area of Ohio. Skeletons 7 to 9 feet tall, and some sources say there were even taller ones that mysteriously disappeared. Number 4 is Lake Delavan, Wisconsin. In 1912, the New York Times reported on 18 skeletons, several over 9 feet, with elongated skulls. Number 3 is Maple Creek, Wisconsin. In 1897, the New York Times reported a 9-foot skeleton with double rows of teeth. Number 2 is the Cahokia, Arkansas mounds around the 1800s. Skeletons up to 10 feet tall with 5-foot legs were reported in local papers and the Scientific American magazine. But the winner chicken dinner is West Hickory, Pennsylvania. In 1870, the Oil City Times ran a story of an 18-foot skeleton with unusual anatomic features, like double rows of teeth, that was reportedly unearthed during oil field work. It was said to be armored and handed over to the Smithsonian. That's more than a little sus. In fact, all of the remains from these top 5 sites have been lost. Coincidence? Doubtful. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, a lot has been made about the idea that the time period when a lot of these articles were printed was a time in American journalism when reporters tended to exaggerate the details a bit to sell a few more papers. And I agree, that certainly was a thing for some newspapers. But let's put this into perspective. If we have, let's just round it to 1,000 printed stories, can they all be exaggerated? Not one of them are true? I can hear you skeptics out there saying, yes, but I just can't believe that's the case. Even if 99% of them were hyped up for clicks, that means 10 of them are still true. As far as I'm concerned, it only takes 1. But for now, let's keep our giant train moving westward with a stop in Nevada. One of the most well-known giant stories in the U.S. is the story of Lovelock Cave, also known as Sunset Cave or Sunset Guano Cave in Nevada. In 1912, ranchers ventured into what looked like an abandoned cave to collect bat guano. The guano in this cave had been building up for centuries and was now a poop gold mine 10 to 15 feet deep. They start digging and were more than a little surprised when their shovels start bringing up artifacts, including duck decoys, baskets, tools, and sandals. Then, jackpot, mummified remains of red-haired giants, standing 6.5 to 7 feet tall. Interesting side note that many of these giants were preserved like Egyptian mummies. Kinda sounds like the Egyptian mummies found in the Grand Canyon. Now, while the ranchers may have been shocked, the local Paiute Indians were not. In 1883, Paiute Princess, Chief's daughter, Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, wrote a book called Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, where she talks about stories passed down from the elders of her people. Stories they believe are not legend, but a historical account. The stories she tells talk of a tribe of red-haired giants known as the Sitika who lived around the lake and in the cave. According to her, these giants were cannibals who ate their dead and waged war on everybody else. The Paiutes get a little fed up, gather a ton of wood, pile it all at the opening of the cave, and light her up. The excavation of the cave uncovered almost 60 giant skeletons, around 7 to 10 feet tall, which, of course, are nowhere to be seen today. But you can see those duck decoys and the sandals, which measure 15 inches long, equivalent to a men's size 29, at the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada. And Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, the chief's daughter who wrote the book, she actually claimed to have a dress made with some of the red hair of the Sitika giant sewn into it. But that was in 1883. No one knows where that dress is today. Or maybe no one's telling. Now let's take a quick side trip up to Mount Shasta. In 1904, British prospector J.C. Brown finds a tunnel into the heart of the mountain and, among other things, several mummies ranging from 6 to 10 feet tall. If you haven't seen our video on Mount Shasta yet, where we go into way deeper detail, the link to that one will be in the description. Now, let's swing back down to Southern California, Catalina Island to be exact. Some of you may be familiar with the excavations of Ralph Glidden from 1919 to 1928. Ralph was an amateur archaeologist who uncovered several large skeletons ranging from 7 to 9 feet tall. But no one seems to know what happened to those skeletons. He was being funded by the Hayes Foundation, who had an association with the Museum of the American Indian, who received at least some of his finds. In 1924, the Hayes Foundation pulled his funding, so Ralph opened his own museum on the island, which stayed open until his death in 1968, at which point his entire collection was transferred to the Catalina Island Museum, who says they received no giant skeletons. In 2012, the museum uncovered some dusty boxes that belonged to Ralph's collection. L.A. Marzulli was invited to come and go through those boxes. He spent 10 hours going through all kinds of papers, but managed to find a few photographs. One in particular caught his attention. It's Ralph standing at a dig site looking over a giant skeleton lying in the dirt. According to L.A., this picture is a real photograph of Ralph at the dig site. Finally, a picture of a giant I can trust. Of course, there are those out there who say, not so fast. They point to the distance between Ralph and the skeleton, claiming it's a trick of perspective. And I get what they're saying, but I don't think that fully covers what I see here. In any case, the Catalina Island Museum dutifully added the photo to their Ralph Glidden exhibit. Except they cropped out the giant skeleton. How cheesy is that? And while we're on the subject of less than honest museums, let's get into this whole Smithsonian debacle. Now, as much as I hate to burst your bubble, there is no smoking gun that we can point to say, see, they're hiding something. All we have is a bunch of circumstantial evidence. Does that evidence add up to the legal standard of a preponderance of the evidence in favor of the Smithsonian being a bunch of liars? I don't know. We may not have a preponderance yet, but we do have some. First, let's talk facts. Fact number 1, we know they have lied in the past. There are several accounts of artifacts that are documented as having been sent to the Smithsonian, which the Smithsonian claims they have no record. Jim Vieira, writer and host of the History Channel's Search for the Lost Giants, talks about finding photos of an 8.5-foot skeleton found and shipped to the Smithsonian in 1933. But the Smithsonian says the tallest skeleton they have is 6'3". To be fair, sometimes they do admit to having these things, but then say no one can see them because they're housed in a separate warehouse that has an asbestos problem that is going to take 10 years to remediate. Wow. I think you guys need to hire a better asbestos remover. Then there's the case of Waldemar Julsrud. He was a German living in Acambro, Mexico, about 175 miles northwest of Mexico City. I don't have a ton of details as to how this whole thing came about, but somehow Waldemar found a site that, when excavated, yielded some 33,500 objects of archaeological interest. Everything from statues to knives made of obsidian, pottery, and human remains. Samples of some items were sent to the University of Pennsylvania and carbon dated to about 4500 BC. Another university studied some samples blind, meaning that they had no idea what they were looking at or where they came from. And that university ruled out the possibility that they were modern creations. They're real. An archaeologist was sent in, not exactly sure by who, but presumably the Smithsonian, to look at the collection. He spent all of 4 hours looking at the then 32,000-piece collection and declared the entire lot a hoax. Archaeological investigator John H. Tierney, who had lectured on the case for decades, charges that the Smithsonian conducted a smear campaign against the discoveries almost from the very beginning. And after filing a FOIA request with the Smithsonian, Tierney announced that the Smithsonian case file on the Acambaro discovery is almost entirely empty. Of course, the most famous case of possible Smithsonian hijinks is the case of G.E. Kincaid. In 1909, when Kincaid discovered evidence of a different civilization taking up residence in the Grand Canyon, the Smithsonian sent S.A. Jordan to give him a hand. After nothing more was heard about their extraordinary find and people started asking questions, the Smithsonian denied that either Kincaid or Jordan had ever worked for them, a denial that they stand behind to this day. We have another episode that goes deeper into this whole story. Link for that one is also in the description. I did see a video that claimed that researcher David Hatcher Childress started to dig into the details and the Smithsonian records in 2013. And that pressure from his findings that the Smithsonian did actually employ both Kincaid and Jordan forced the museum to finally cave and publish a retraction of their long-standing denial on their own website. Trouble is, I can't find evidence of that retraction anywhere. So I don't think that really happened. Okay, none of that looks good. But add to that some history of the direction and ideology of the institution itself. John Wesley Powell served as the first director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology from 1879 to 1902. He wasn't necessarily a bad guy. He actually held a great affection for the Native Americans. However, he also believed in isolationism, the idea that the Native American culture advanced and developed in a vacuum with no outside influences, and that their culture was primitive and needed to be wiped out by assimilation. In any case, nice guy or not, I can see where it would be easy to let one's own ideologies be the jury on the value of discoveries that don't fit your worldview. But even better is a guy named Alish Hrdlicka. He was the first curator of physical anthropology of the Smithsonian in 1904 and held that position until 1941. This guy was a piece of work. He was a eugenicist who believed that there were only 3 races in the entire world: white, black, and yellow and brown. Basically, everybody else. When this guy excavated mummies, he would ship the bones home without the skin. Total disregard for the mummy as a whole. He only cared about the bones because that was his personal focus and expertise. This guy had no concept of the big picture. And he wholeheartedly was of the opinion that people had not been in North America for more than 3,000 years. Okay, I get it. We have information before that he did not have back then when forming his opinions. But here's the part that scares me. And this is quoted straight from Wikipedia. Hrdlicka and others made it virtually taboo for any anthropologist desirous of a successful career to advocate a deep antiquity for inhabitants of the Americas. In other words, agree with me or I will bury you. Now, I get it. Both of these guys were products of their times, and maybe not in any way indicative of the fine people seeking truth over ideology that have been running the place ever since then. However, these two guys were at the helm at the same time frame that a lot of these giant remains were recovered. Imagine what damage may have been done that can never be undone. Maybe the Smithsonian is telling the truth about not having any of these artifacts in their possession because of the careless decisions of certain individuals 100 years ago. Maybe someday the Smithsonian will open its warehouses for all to see their 157 million artifacts. But I'm not holding my breath. Okay. Wow, that was a serious sidetrack. So let's get back in line by talking about where all of this history puts us today. Are these giants who, according to the Bible, live very long lives, still walking among us today? Well, there are quite a few people who say yes. Probably the most famous of modern-day encounter stories is the Kandahar giant. We have a full episode on this story, link in the description, so I won't go too deep into the weeds. But it's the story of an American Army platoon in 2002 that encounters a giant living in a cave in the mountains of Afghanistan and gets wiped out. When another platoon is sent to look for the first one, they encounter the giant as well, but manage to kill it. The giant's body is recovered and secretly sent to the U.S. The only reason we know about it is because the guy who flew the body, at least part of the way, became a whistleblower. Then, more personnel came forward after that, including an Afghani soldier. We have an exclusive members-only video of him telling his story as well. And we have more stories from the Solomon Islands. Back in 1942, the Japanese occupied the island of Guadalcanal. When U.S. Marines landed on the island to retake it from the Japanese, they were surprised at the relatively small number of Japanese soldiers inhabiting the island, considering its military value. They forced the Japanese from the beaches deeper into the jungle, a place the Japanese did not want to go. Stories started to emerge of giants that lived in the jungle who were picking off the Japanese one by one and eating them alive. Giants that stood anywhere from 8 to 15 feet tall. I know that isn't exactly current news, but if you ask anyone on the islands about Mango, they'll tell you a story that's hard to forget. Mango Bosameta was a resident of Guadalcanal. Sometime around 1960, she disappears. Friends and family look for her for weeks until they finally give her up for dead. 25 years later, she's found close to her village, scrounging for food and pregnant. The villagers manage to capture her. It takes a while, but after a little time goes by, Mango is able to come back to her senses enough to tell her story. She'd been captured by the giants and taken as a wife. Field archaeologist Nicholas Cox went out to the islands and started asking around about the giants to the locals. The locals just tell him, yep, they're real. And then they go on to tell of a recent story from the 1990s. A crew was trying to clear some land for a future gold mine when their bulldozer blade, weighing over 1,000 pounds, breaks right off. They couldn't do anything with it until they got a new part for it the next day, so they just leave it in the clearing. Who's gonna take it? The next morning, they return to the site to find the blade missing, replaced with footprints measuring between 3 and 4 feet long. They follow the prints and find the blade in the trees about 400 feet away. Moving on to other parts of the world, on September 27, 1989, in the Russian city of Voronezh, about 200 miles south of Moscow, strange lights appear in the sky, witnessed by a whole bunch of people. These witnesses see a spacecraft land in a public park, and 3 giant alien figures emerge. Denis Marenko, who was a kid at the time but was in the park that day, sees a huge man who resembles a human but significantly larger get off the spacecraft. Moments later, the giant just disappears. January 3rd, 1996, in the town of Yatzitz, about 25 miles west of Jerusalem, Chief of Security Herzl Constantini is at home when he hears a strange noise outside. He opens his door and is frozen in fear at the 11-foot-tall, 5-foot-wide giant standing in his front yard. Herzl estimates the weight of this thing at about 2 tons. Not knowing what else to do, he calls the police. 2 officers respond, but are laughing at him, assuming this guy's gotta be drunk. However, they change their tune when they see the tracks in Herzl's yard. Then there's episode number 746 of the Confessionals podcast, where the host, Tony Merkel, is joined by Pastor Troy Brewer, who talks about his experience seeing a giant while down in Mexico.
I told my son, I said, Ben, turn around and tell me what you see up there. He just pulls out a chair and he sits down and goes, a freaking giant. I said, yeah. I said, hey, Jerry. I said, what? I said, don't panic. Tell me what you see at the top of that ridge. He goes, it's a giant.
Now, of course, as technology gets better and better and cheap enough that just about everyone can afford a cell phone, videos of so-called giants are getting more and more common. Those of you who've watched this channel for a while might remember our video on Andrew Dawson, who is either lucky enough or unlucky enough to capture this video. Link in the description for this one as well if you want the full story of craziness that goes along with this footage. And there are plenty more where that one came from. So what are these things? Are they the Nephilim as told in the Bible? Are they the unfortunate byproduct of alien-human hybrid experimentation? Or are they something more earthly? I, for one, have a hard time dismissing what, to me, is an obvious link between the idea of 10-foot giants seemingly all around the world and the other 10-foot creatures that are also seemingly all around the world, our fuzzy friend, Bigfoot. Is it possible that these creatures are either one in the same or at least closely related? Maybe. Bigfoot tracks with 6 toes have been found, like this one from Glenn Rehberger 4 on TikTok from Kilcoy, Queensland, Australia in 2023. Lots of witnesses to Bigfoot sightings describe the creature as having reddish hair, and both are at least partially known as hanging out around caves. Maybe there's a link there that needs a deeper dive in the future. But that is going to have to wait for another day. It was everything I could do to get all the stuff in this one that I did. I didn't even get a chance to touch on so many other things, like all of the accounts of the 17th century explorers who encountered giants related to the stories of Hollow Earth, and evidence of footprints left in rock formations. There is enough information out there to easily create a 10-hour docu-series. Maybe someday we'll tackle a few of those things that we didn't get to touch on, but that will have to wait for another day. But I will leave you with an interesting thought. Jenny Randalls is the former director of the British UFO Research Association, who keeps tabs on all reports they get, which are often not about UFOs at all, but just about weird things that someone witnesses, and that person wants to get their experience on record. Jenny analyzed 15,000 reports of encounters with various beings, giants being thrown in that mix. The result? Encounters with giants have increased every single year since 1965, so way more reports coming in than there were 40 or 50 years ago. Now, maybe some of that increase comes from people not feeling the stigma associated with reporting something that sounds crazy like they did in generations gone by. So, are we just reporting these encounters more often than we used to? Or are more giants coming? Holy Toledo. Why is Toledo holy? That was a crazy amount of information packed into a relatively short amount of time. I am truly sorry that I couldn't get to absolutely everything. It's just too huge of a subject. See what I did there? But let us know in the comments if there is an area that I didn't touch on here that you would like to see us tackle in a future episode. If you thought giants were incredible, this one will absolutely blow your mind. Click right here because seriously, you cannot miss this. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.